Okay. Okay, the link is in Board Docs. Let me start messaging folks. Mr. Walker's joining right now.
Um, yeah, Christina, hi, how are you?
Hi.
Um, my computer is struggling, so I'll log on with my computer after it gets sorted out. Anyway, I'm here.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, I have messaged everyone. I don't know if you want to give it a minute or go ahead and get started. And sorry, that was for you, Ms. Oh,
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay. Okay, that is 2 minutes, and I have Mr. Soledger also joined, and a few others responded they will, just getting to their devices. So
We're all set?
yes, we're streaming, and the link is on board doc, so we're good to go.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name's Shantae Brody. I'm the chair of the Hartford Board of Education. You're joining us for our October 2025 Finance Committee meeting. So with that said, welcome everyone, and I'm going to turn it over to our CFO, Ms. Caitlin Richards.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you for spending it with us. So this is our Board Finance Committee meeting for October. We have not met as a Board Finance Committee since May. So this will be a media agenda. Go into slideshow. Where we're going to talk about last fiscal year, the current fiscal year, and then next fiscal year. So I'll go through each section and then we'll pause for questions and discussion at the end of each. Like I said, meaty topics, so I do want to make sure we get through it in an hour and a half. I told Christine I wanted 12 hours and she laughed at me. So we will keep it to the agenda, but just wanted to preview that we have these three big topics. So I'm going to start with talking about the end of last fiscal year. So the fiscal year that ended at the end of June. So the big takeaway from last fiscal year, we had been messaging we were expecting around a 4 to 6 million deficit at the end of the year. It ended up being closer to 10. This was driven by the factors we've been discussing, transportation, tuition, et cetera, being higher than what we thought. Unfortunately, some of the biggest cost drivers of the budget are also the pieces that are the hardest to predict, although we're trying to get better at that over time. Alongside, we did have more revenue than we expected in grants, but just not as much as we thought or would fully mitigate that gap. So the takeaway there is about a $10 million gap that's going to be covered by the city. I'll go into a couple more details on a few slides, but that's the main thing to know, is that's where the end of last year landed. When we get into the specifics, the way that I think about this is there's things working against us and then there's things working for us. So the things working against us, these were all things we talked about in the spring. We just now have the final numbers on where we landed. So fixed costs is our biggest category of things that were higher than what we anticipated, particularly transportation, but also tuition, utilities, and buildings and grounds. So these are the category of thing we have the least amount of control over. And so again, they can be hard to predict as a lot of things change even as the year goes on, especially related to special education. We also discussed some revenue assumptions that were in the budget that didn't pan out. These were known already, but do factor into that deficit. We did have vacancy savings. They just were not as high as we originally thought. Part of this was because of a few things. One, we hired a lot of paras in the second semester of last year when the rules changed around qualifications for that, as well as some retro payments that were part of contract negotiations last year. So overall, all of those things working against us totaled around $27 million. When we look on the other hand of things working for us, so things that help mitigate the gap, we had two big categories of things. And so the first was grant revenues that were not included in the original budget. And you may remember that for the budget for this year, we tried to include everything we possibly could, so we had a better sense of what was going to happen ahead of time. But these included grants like our North Hartford Ascents Pipeline, Magnet extracurricular grants. There was some added state funding for excess cost. So those things were working in our favor. And then we also just had underspend. So this is also something that's hard to monitor over the course of the year, but it's essentially we had budgeted for certain things, but not all of them happened. And this tends to happen in non-salary pieces that are in our locus of control. So things like contracts, communication, supplies, that type of thing. We saw some underspend in that area. So those worked in our favor to the tune of about 17 million. And so that gap of 10 is the difference between those two things. So we had $27 million working against us, 17 for us. So we ended with that gap of 10. So that explains a bit of kind of what happened. And then what we're thinking through is how do we address this moving forward? There's a piece of this that is for the budget for the current year, so FY26. We obviously made a lot of decisions around reductions. We secured some additional funding that start to address some of those structural challenges, and tried to get really clear about what we were predicting around things like transportation and tuition. And then a piece of it, and we're going to get into this today with already starting to do a year-end projection for this year, is just having a really strong budget monitoring process. So making sure we're making our projections as accurate as possible. There will always be things we can't predict. I think that's a big takeaway, but there are things that we can continue to get better at understanding on a more regular basis that can help us with communication and making any decisions. So that's the first two pieces. And then the last just is coordination with the city. I've worked really closely with the city finance team on this particular matter. The next big step is they will take it to city council, I believe on October 20th, where they will approve the funding transfer, because technically it's a transfer from the city to us to clear last year. But just continuing to work with them really closely and being really clear and transparent on our end of some of the dynamics that we're seeing. We're going to do some of that today. And also, just giving them as much heads up as possible so that they can look across all the different things going on in their budget as well. So I'm going to pause here. That's the status of last fiscal year. Again, that's the year that ended at the end of June. Everything is closed out. We just now have the final numbers. And the next big step is the city doing the transfer to cover the year-end deficit. I will pause there for questions or discussion.
Mr. Walker has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And great presentation, Caitlin. This is certainly an improvement over prior cycles. So that's really good news. The question I have for you, you talked about, which is great, that the kind of pluses and minuses and how that kind of balanced out. I guess what I'm asking is lessons learned. I didn't quite see that slide where there are certain things that you felt like were some lessons learned that we won't do this again. We actually did this great last year. This we need to do a lot better than we did last year. Did your team look at it from that standpoint? And maybe you did it internally, you have to not sharing with us. That's kind of my question.
Yeah, no, I love lessons learned. And I think this slide it's trying to get at the spirit of that, but I can talk more precisely to one of the things for sure that I think was a lesson learned was around some of those big fixed expense categories. And so when we did the budget for this current year around tuition, especially just because it's such a big category in transportation, we really looked at historical trends in terms of how much it had been increasing year by year. And so those budgets for this year are significantly higher than they were in years past. So I feel more confident about tuition and transportation. We'll get into when we talk FY26, what's happening on the salary front, because that's a different dynamic. So I think there's a piece there of just better understanding the pieces of our budget and using historical data to predict what they will be in the future. And then I think the other big lesson learned is just having the process to understand this earlier. Like ideally, this is something that we are understanding as early in the year as possible. And so my team has been meeting almost every week to look at the current year data to try to understand, okay, what do we know about vacancies? What does that mean for the budget? Let's look at a year-end projection. And so I think part of the lesson learned was routine and how we're baking this into the routines of the team to constantly be updating the data that we have and then sharing it with you all.
Yeah, great. Those nice summaries.
Ms. Fortune? There you go.
Thank you. Caitlin, could you speak a little bit more about, I don't know if you have insight into the city's funds that they're using to cover that 10 million shortfall? Could you speak a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, I will share with you what I know, which is that it is my understanding. So the city is ending the year with a surplus, and the surplus is large enough to cover this and actually still add to their fund balance, I believe, because there's a requirement around that within MARB that they are adding to the fund balance every year to maintain our status as, I think we're a tier 2 district now. But the short of it is they had a surplus and it's big enough to cover this.
And if there was no surplus from the city?
It would be the fund balance. They do have a fund balance right now. I don't have the exact number of how big it is, but it would have to have come from their reserves essentially.
Are you all set, Ms. Fortune, for the moment?
I am for the moment.
Okay. Mr. Tatum?
I had the same question as Ms. Fortune did. And part of my understanding is that like this dynamic is not uncommon, that people such as the BOE advocate for additional funds, kind of knowing that the city will likely run a surplus. And so couldn't there be some rebudgeting at the city level in anticipation of that surplus? But the city kind of likes to have a surplus for precisely these reasons. So my sense from navigating some of these conversations over the past couple of years is that that's kind of how the dance goes. And yeah, if they, if for example they had given us $10 million in the spring when we had asked for it for this fiscal year, they wouldn't have had it to backfill this deficit from the last fiscal year.
Yes, there's definitely a dance, and they're doing their own projection process, right, of what they anticipate, et cetera, and then allowing for unanticipated pieces to come up. So you're right. I think a dance is a good way to describe it. And that's why we're trying to collaborate with them more often, because when we get into FY26, you'll see we're facing a similar dynamic already for a few reasons. And so communicating with them, I've already communicated with them about it so that they can start to factor it into their projections. But yes, I think a dance is it's a good descriptor.
Okay, I don't see any other hands. You want to proceed?
Yep. So now I'm going to shift us into the current year. And so this is a direct application of lessons learned of we are trying to, as early as possible, start to assess the trends in the current year and what that could mean for our finances at the end of the year so that we can do some of this work with the city and anything that we need to do on our end. So I think that these are the main takeaways. I'm going to go into slides that describe each of these pieces. One is just the process improvement of trying to do this as early as possible. And then the key takeaways, we're going to go into some data on enrollment. We're going to have more coming actually in the coming weeks once we finalized October 1, but essentially enrollment is down significantly from last year. And we'll talk a bit about some of the root causes. The good news, definitely good news for teachers and for kids, is our vacancy rate is significantly less than it was last year. And you all heard that in the State of Talent update last week. The numbers for certified staff, it's gone from 13% to 3%, which is, it's a huge decrease. What that means though is because we assumed 6% vacancies in the budget is we're not going to realize all of the vacancy savings. So we're going to talk about that piece too and what that means for the budget for this year. Again, we don't know everything about the budget for this year. We know very little about tuition or transportation yet, but how enrollment affects our revenue and how our staffing fill rates affect our expenses are something that we have some data on now. So I'm going to start with enrollment just to set the scene. So on the left here were our enrollment projections. What those were based on were last year's actuals. So they were an average of October 1st and I believe a mid-January date. An average of those two dates of enrollment is what we used for the projection for next year. And then what you'll see is the actual 10-1 enrollment at each of those grade levels. And that's where you see an overall difference of about 1,400 students. You can see some of the areas that are larger. So kindergarten for sure. We'll talk about why that may be. 6th grade, and then in high school as well, especially 9th grade and 10th grade is where some of those larger differences between last year and this year are. And this is a historical chart. So this is the biggest enrollment drop in the past decade. And so I think that that's significant because it's larger than even what happened during COVID. That was about 1,000 students seemingly, about 1,000 students a year during that time. And so this is a significant difference than what we've seen in the past. Obviously, enrollment has been declining. You can see that from school year 14, but the rate at which it dropped this year is significant. And you can see actually in the past 3 years or so, since the 22-23 school year, enrollment has been pretty stable. And so that was the idea, was that maybe it'll be around that 16.5 number that it was last year and in the 2 prior years. But this is a pretty big drop. So I'm going to talk about why we might be seeing this. Like I said, we're going to do a deeper presentation on this once we have finalized October 1 data, where we can really go in and see where exactly did students enroll, like which specific schools. But I do want to go over some of the drivers that we know about. So one is that there was a change to the kindergarten eligibility law. And so this is essentially, it's a lower or a higher age you have to be enrolled in kindergarten. And so we think that's partly what's driving the kindergarten specific, at least part of that kindergarten specific difference. There also have been additional seats being opened as part of the CHEF CCP. So as part of the settlement in 2022, more seats were opened. And I believe it was by this current year, it was going to be 1,600 more seats were opened in CHEF operators. So that's where we're going to be doing more analysis to see how many Hartford resident students are now attending other schools within CHEF, and how is that different than the previous few years. So that will be forthcoming. There are also fewer suburban students enrolling in our magnet schools. So specifically 87 fewer suburban students enrolled in our magnet schools as of October 1, which is the date that matters for the magnet school enrollment and funding. And then this piece is a national trend. So I've been talking to CFOs in other districts, including Boston, and there's a big hypothesis that there is a huge decrease in newcomer students, largely based on immigration-related concerns with the current federal climate. And so we don't have data specifically on this. We do see a drop in about 400 students for multilingual learners since last year, which is really significant for our population. And so that kind of gives us some indication of what might be happening. And like I said, this is something that cities across the country are experiencing and might be explaining the fact that this drop has been more significant than any other year, because they are also seeing bigger drops than what they've experienced before. And the last piece is just related to chronic absenteeism, some hypotheses potentially that unrelated to immigration, students are not coming to school to the degree to which that they're actually no-shows or being dropped out as a result of not attending at the beginning of the school year. So these are hypotheses. We have some data to support it, but like I said, this is going to, we're going to come with some more details around it. But this is some of what is driving that big difference. And I'm just going to move through these slides again, just for this fiscal year, FY26, and then we'll open it up for any questions or discussion, and I can head back to any slides. So now I'm going to turn, so that was enrollment. So enrollment is one of the things that impacts our revenue. I'll talk about that in a minute. The other big factor is our vacancies. And so as you heard in our State of Talent update last week, and it's a huge win, is that we have significantly decreased vacancies. And this is across the board. And so I highlighted here special ed. This is data from the beginning of the school year last year to the beginning of the school year this year. And you see at the beginning of last year, we had a 25% special ed teacher vacancy rate. It's now down to 9%. And so some of this is because of decreased roles, but not most of it, because we didn't actually cut any special education teacher roles, and we are seeing a higher fill rate. And so a lot of this, as we talked about last week, is attributed to the salary changes. So eliminating those bottom 3 steps seems to have been very significant for hiring teachers. So this is overall a win. It is a thing that is good for kids and teachers, and it is not good for the budget. And our vacancy rate last year was at 13% at this time, and it's actually, as of this week, down to 3%. So we even have fewer vacancies than at the start of the school year. And what we assumed was around 6%. And so we all talked about that a lot. We were trying to make a realistic assumption, and going from 13 to 6% is a very significant decrease in vacancies that we hypothesized would be because of salaries, and to go all the way to 3 is unexpected in some ways. And I know we had even certain city council members asking, should we make it even higher so we don't need to cut as much? And so this is another dance when it comes to vacancies. It's an assumption in the budget. It's a prediction. It is hard to know. And so this is important because we essentially have half of the vacancies that we thought we were going to have. So it's a big victory in terms of filling roles in our classrooms, and it means we have a better predictor that when we have a role, we're going to fill it, but it will impact the budget for this year. So I'm going to turn to that now and say, okay, based on what I just talked about, what does that mean for us financially? And so I'll start with enrollment. And so two pieces here on enrollment and how it relates to our budget. So one way in which enrollment relates to our budget is the Alliance Grant. So the Alliance Grant, as a reminder, is actually just part of our ECS funding that we get in the form of a grant because we are an Alliance district. And essentially back in the spring, the state did estimates for what our Alliance Grant increase was going to be. The reason it was increasing is because the state fully funded the ECS formula for this year, which was part of the legislative action that we were really excited about. However, the state has now updated its calculations, and it's actually based on enrollment from 23-24. So not the current year's enrollment, but when you saw that slide with the declining enrollment, they updated the enrollment data to be the year they actually base it off of, which is about 3.4 million fewer dollars. And so this was an estimate. It was taken directly from the state. They then updated their calculations to factor in a more recent year of enrollment data, which was lower, which is leading to a gap in the amount that we had thought we were going to get for the Alliance Grant versus now. The other piece of this that enrollment impacts, and this is where this year's enrollment has the biggest impact. So that October 1 date is really significant for magnet schools because that is the date by which our magnet operating grant is determined based off of. Because there are 87 fewer students, and it's all based on the suburban students. So we get money, it's essentially the ECS funding we get for suburban students who enroll in our magnets. Because we have 87 fewer students than last year, we're estimating that it's going to be about 1.2 million less in the magnet operating grant than what we had originally anticipated. So this is how enrollment affects revenue. It's nuanced because the Alliance Grant is actually more a state estimate and using historical data, and then the magnet operating grant is based on current year data. The difference there is about, it's $4.7 million. The other piece on revenue I wanted to touch on while I have you is that we actually do have more revenue in other areas than we anticipated. And these are all of the competitive grants that the state has come out. This is mostly the competitive grants the state has come out for magnet schools and open choice schools, and then also our SIG schools, or SIG funding for CSI schools, which is School Improvement Grant for Comprehensive Support Improvement Schools. So those are our schools with the lowest performance. And so you can see here that we've gotten grant amounts. So for magnet schools, it's the social academic grant, it's the athletics grant, acceptance grant, and open choice also has some dollars. And so these are revenue sources that were not in the original budget that we now have access to because the state has come out with them, our schools has applied for them, and they have received them. But the point I want to make, so this is great for schools. So this means schools are getting these dollars directly. They're going into their budgets. They're determining things that align with their school needs and the intent of the grant. This revenue comes with those associated expenses, so it can't help us cover the other revenue sources. Because you could look at the math here and say, okay, we're about 4.5 short over here. We got about $4 million more here. But because of the way the grants work, that's not possible. And so the loss of revenue on the other front is just a loss of revenue. And this gain of revenue is going specifically to school sites to spend on things aligned with those grants. On the expense side, and then we will pause shortly just to discuss and have questions. So now we're looking at our year-end projection on our expense side. And like I said, the vacancy estimate is too high. We set an estimate of about 6%. It's closer now to about 3%, which means we'll probably only realize half of what we thought we would in vacancy savings, and that includes benefits. So it's about $10 to $11 million. It is also based on the specific roles that we fill or not fill. Obviously, teachers are more expensive than other roles. So that's a more precise estimate based on the data we have now of essentially if everyone on our payroll right now continues throughout the year, that would be the gap in what we predicted. And then when we look at some other areas, it's really too early to tell on some of those fixed expenses pieces. Like I said, we budgeted a lot higher for those categories for this year. So those are likely stronger assumptions. But we will continue to monitor anything on the tuition front, transportation front, et cetera, we will have to keep an eye on as we look at the data to see where students went. If more students are enrolling in other schools, that will likely have an impact on our tuition and transportation. But again, too early in those areas. We likely will have underspend on various non-salary things. There might be other opportunities for revenue. So there are things that we have yet to learn. But as of what we know now is that enrollment is affecting our revenue and that our vacancies are affecting our expense estimate. I think that's, oh, then I'll do one more slide and then we're going to pause. So what do we do now is the question. And so like I emphasized, ongoing collaboration with the city. So I have shared this information with the city finance team, obviously sharing it now with you all, and we're going to have ongoing conversations with them. The first step is just being transparent and making sure everyone's aware of the situation and what our assumptions were versus what the reality is now, and trying to do that in October as opposed to at the end of the year. I will say, in a situation like this, where you have significant enrollment decline, one move typically would be right-sizing your staffing to the enrollment for students. The reason this move is very challenging for us is we filled most of our positions. So if you had a bunch of vacant positions and you also had lower student enrollment, you can do some right-sizing. That is helpful. We are looking at any adjustments we can make without major disruptions, just that makes sense. But that is one piece that makes this more difficult. And again, we can examine anything non-salary, but a lot of this will be in collaboration with the city. And then what I'll say is, in terms of lessons learned in planning for next year, and we'll go into this in the next set of slides, this impacts our assumptions for next year. And so for next year, we will be assuming lower enrollment, and what that will translate to fewer staffing allocations because those are run through formulas. We will also assume fewer vacancies for next year because I think with the current salary schedule that we have, we can safely assume we will be back to a lower vacancy rate. So the key will be, now that we have these data points, we will need to work those into the budget projection for next year. So partly working through this year, working with the city, and then using what we know now for next year. I will pause there. I know that was a lot, and we can touch on any of it, and I'm happy to go back to any of the slides.
Okay, Caitlin, could you speak to, like that, we mentioned October 1, like a few times. I know what October 1 means, but I want to ground it for all of us and then even for some of the listening audience. Because for board members, what my conversation with Ms. Richard has been along the lines of us even knowing like our trends as opposed to like who comes back after October 1st, after the funding has been set. Where are they coming back from? Traditionally over more than a decade, we do see some of our students returning to us from other districts, and they're not counted in our funding, but we have to educate them. So October 1st is it safe to say, and I don't know if anyone else from the team is here, because sometimes magnet enrollment kind of trickle, like they'll take a few kids here, there, but by October 1st, that ends, correct?
Yes. And so we definitely will, when we do the deeper dive in enrollment, bring the trend during the year, but I've looked at some of it. And so, yes, so October 1, thank you for calling that out. It is the date that is our official enrollment count for the district. For magnet schools, that is the last date students can enroll in that magnet school. And so the trend that we see in magnet school enrollment over the course of the year is October 1 is typically the highest, and then it trickles out after that. It is also the date, that October 1, that is used for the magnet operating grant. So when the state goes to give us money for the current year for magnet schools, it's how many suburban students are enrolled in your magnet schools as of October 1st. For neighborhood schools, we actually see a trend where enrollment tends to increase over time, especially in the elementary and middle schools. So between October and maybe January towards the end of the year, we do get more students coming into our schools. The reason the October 1 date is important more broadly for more than just magnet funding is it is what the ECS funding calculations are based off of, but it's from 2 years prior. And so that's the piece that, and I've been trying to, learn all the nuances, but it will impact us, that October 1 date, but it won't be until 2 years in the future. And the last piece I'll add is because we are an alliance district, the state can never give us less ECS and alliance funding than we got the last year. And so what's happening to us right now is it's not as much more as we thought we were going to get, but the state can never take away that. They can never give us less ECS and alliance funding we've gotten previously. We might just not get an increase. And so those are all the way, it impacts it in a lot of different ways, but October 1 is a really, really important date because that's our official enrollment and it influences various funding streams.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Walker?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Caitlin, I have a couple questions around the compliance with SHAP and the exploding number of seats. I want to put I guess a recommendation out for us and the board in general to now begin to put together the numbers now to show early warning of district instability because of the STEP versus nil compliance. I think the background is a couple of years ago when I first got on the board, and that proposal to fulfill the seat and waiting list type of thing, and so they were going to explode the number of seats available. We anecdotally said amongst ourselves at that point that was going to lead to potential instability in enrollment in the district, because that enticement is going to be pretty much one way. Folks will go to the more affluent districts. Folks are not necessarily going to roll in big numbers into the less affluent districts. And so we now, for the first year, have some early numbers to really show that. I think we need to show that because that drop you've shown is not based on district performance in some way. It's based on the availability of all these ways out that the state has funded. And the reason I think it's important to show it is that they funded on one end, and then, as you just suggested, because of the predicted number of student departures, we get cut on the back end. And so it was one of the reasons we advocated for changing the funding model, because it just builds in some inequity in the name of equity. And so I just want to give it you to flesh out and elevate this to our chair as well, that I think we should have a topic where we really take your numbers and do a workout session to really make this story well understood. I mean, are you seeing that same thing, that the chef is creating two dynamics? One, we unexpectedly lost students, and we've also kind of unexpectedly have lost funding, but not really unexpectedly.
Yes, and I don't want to jump too far ahead. In a couple of slides, I'm going to show a slide of our long-term fiscal outlook and just looking at revenue and expense for students who choose to leave Hartford and how that explains most of our deficit. And so I think it's exactly what you're saying. It's a continued cycle, right? Where additional seats are open, additional students leave, we lose funding, we have to cut programming for our students, and then additional students leave. And so, yes, we'll talk in a couple slides about the financial component of that, but my read is it's what you're describing.
And I'll wait for that. And so, a quick follow-up. My concern is what we would call a death spiral, because what you've said is our ECF is based on 23-24. When they get up to basing it on 25-26 and 26-27, I'm really fearful that we won't have enough money. So I'll wait for your slides, and then maybe we can take it forward from there.
Thank you, Ms. Fortune.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are along the same lines. Do you have the numbers for enrollment of suburban students, say in Craig schools? Or are we seeing that just here in HPS or other magnet operators seeing that as well?
That's what the data team is working on right now. So they're taking all the October 1 data, and we're able to see, at least for Hartford resident students, where they've ended up. But I agree, getting the data on CREC in general and what other suburban districts are experiencing. So that is ideally part of the analysis.
Okay, thank you. And then, so the part that I think I've been struggling with, and I now am struggling with it in new ways, is this idea that you mentioned in terms of the reduction within our budget. You said, if we had essentially more vacancies, we could reshuffle staff because of the lower enrollment. But we've just hired a lot of the staff over the past, literally the past, not even 6 months, right? The past 4 months, that we knew that enrollment numbers had been declining. Wasn't there the opportunity to more proactively reshuffle staff? Because I struggle with the idea that we lay off people, then we invite them back, we hire more people, then all of a sudden we have too many people. It just seems like there's some planning missed opportunities, or am I not understanding this?
No, I think this is a great question. And what I'll say, one, yes, there's always a way that we should be using what we now to inform our assumptions. What I will say on the enrollment front is when you look at this slide of 23, 24, 25, I think it was reasonable at the time to assume we weren't going to drop 1,400 students because that hasn't happened in the past decade. And so I think that the assumption around enrollment, although wrong, was understandable because it was saying, okay, it'll probably stay similar to what's been happening. We now know more, right? And I would not say the same for next year. And so that the enrollment number is what dictates the total number of staffing allocations because we're running that through the formulas to say, for every 24 students, give 1 teacher, whatever it may be. The other assumption is the vacancy assumption. And that is the other one where we're also trying to make a prediction of, we were at 13. We said, let's go to 6. We feel like that's realistic, but really it's 3. And so you're not wrong in terms of what you're saying. It's just, they're 2 separate things. One is, what do we predict for enrollment? That's going to dictate how many staff allocations we put out there. And then what do we predict for vacancies? And that'll how many of those allocations we actually fill. And so it's both of those things are happening at one time, where we are in a situation right now where, because we have fewer students, we actually have more staffing allocations than we need, and we have filled more than we thought. And so the correction for next year would be to say, we're going to predict lower enrollment because now we have a better sense. That would be fewer total allocations. And we're going to predict we're going to fill most of them.
Are you all set, Ms.
I
Fortune?
guess no one in.
Oh, yeah, I think you were, I didn't see you move. Go ahead.
Sorry. Can you hear me okay?
It was a
It's
little fuzzy, but now I can.
Yeah. It's a slight.
Okay. I was going to say, it makes sense to me why that assumption was as it is, given that I think arguably this huge drop is because of immigration, and not something that fully anticipated because this is so unprecedented. Do you know just I understand we're not the only school district experiencing a decline in enrollment. How does ours fare relative to other school districts? Because I'm curious, if our numbers are much higher, then we know perhaps it's because Chef plays a factor and more kids are choosing CREC and other schools as well. But if it's on pace with other districts or comparable districts, then, I suppose I would interpret that differently.
I had the same exact thought. So in terms of finding out other districts, I'm actually going to a CFO conference in 2 weeks where it's going to be some of the main urban districts across the country. And we're talking about exactly this. I guess everyone is asked to talk about enrollment decline. So I think that will give me a better sense of what did other districts like ours experience on October 1? And to your point, basically how much of the magnitude of what we're seeing is probably related to immigration concerns. And then separately, I think with the data team doing the analysis on where did kids go? Because if we can tag specific schools to those students that are other Chef schools, we know that's where they went. But if there's students we just can't account for, it's likely something like this. And so we will come back probably at a workshop or something and do the enrollment deep dive, but I'll at least be able to say what I heard from colleagues across the country. And then we should have the data on for the kids we know who enrolled in another school, how much of that drop is attributed to that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And one of the things that I did say in our conversation with Miss Richard is that we know where a kid, we might not know the kids who don't land somewhere for various reasons that we've talked about over the years, but for kids transferring, we know who's requesting. They have to get the transcript from us, so we know where they go. And for the kids that return to us, we know where they come from. So we do have data that we can start putting in certain categories, so the board can be clear of the trends of students leaving and then students coming to us. But with that, Ms. Darastel Ledger, I see your hand.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. My question is with regards to when, after that October 1 date, that deadline, when students come back into the district or come into the district, does money follow them? For example, if they're coming from, say, an ascending town or like a magnet school, magnet area, does money come in with them? That's the first question that I have.
So money would not, so the only students that are going to count, so for students coming into our magnet schools, the only ones that count are the ones that are there on October 1st. And for the most part, that's the cutoff for magnet enrollment. For neighborhood schools, we might have students coming in, maybe they're new to the area. I think there is a trend in newcomer students coming during the year. There is not funding that follows those students. And so we are given our funding based on the count of students we had 2 years ago on October 1st. And so we don't get any more resources during the school year if more students come in. If there was the one scenario in which it could affect us is if there was a student who chose to leave and say, go to a different school district, and then they come back and say we were paying for special education tuition expenses, we would stop paying those tuition expenses and instead take on the services ourselves for the student. So we're not getting any more revenue. We still would be paying expenses because the student is getting services, but we wouldn't be paying tuition to that other district. But the high level answer is there isn't dollars that follow kids if they're coming midway through the year.
Okay. And would you say, is it safe to say that flat funding is something that's a continuing concern?
100%, yes.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't make it back to my buttons. So with that said, we're on to the next set of slides.
Yep, and I think this is a great transition because I'm going to start talking about the future. So we've talked about last year, we've talked about this year, and this is really now going to be future looking into our budget process coming up for next year and looking at the long-term fiscal outlook. And these are the questions I hear you asking, and I think that's great because we do need to talk about the structural nature of this challenge. And so with this slide, it's at least attempting to show how I'm thinking about this, and I think how we as a group have been trying to approach it. But in this budget development process, this blue piece is having the best data we possibly can. So we've been talking about how can we make really strong assumptions? How can we understand enrollment, vacancies, et cetera, so that we're operating with the latest and greatest data, which really helps us understand the pieces of the budget that are our biggest cost drivers, that are the most uncertain, that we most need to make change around. And then really there's two categories here. And we talked about this a lot last year. There's the structural change we need to make and the advocacy we need to do to change how we are funded, alongside the strategic decisions we need to make in order to be as efficient as possible. And we're often balancing those two things of, we need to be as make reductions in the way that we can. And we also need to change how this bigger picture is operating so that we don't need to make as many reductions. And then we have that thread of community engagement. And so that's both a educational, let's make sure people understand what those changes are that would be the most impactful for our finances, and how do we have a conversation with the community and get their input on the most important things in our budget. And so I've kind of been thinking about these dual roles. We need all the right data, numbers wise. We also need the input from our community. And what we're trying to do is understand both the big picture and change that, and then make the decisions that are in our locus of control. To that end, what I'm going to share now, and this will get at some of the questions around how the whole dynamic of school choice is impacting our funding. So we had a MARB, so Municipal Accountability Review Board. That's the meeting we have at the state level because Hartford is I think a tier 2 district, which means we meet on a monthly basis with the state to discuss our finances. The city meets as well. It's mostly an FYI. And so one of the pieces that I did was share a 5-year projection. And so I'm going to share that with you. And I've updated actually already based on the latest data. So I've factored in already, okay, now we know enrollment's likely declining. We know we're likely going to fill more staff positions. And we know that salaries are likely, or they are going to increase next year based on the contracts. And then what I'll show you is that slide I just mentioned, that we're going to look at this just for Hartford resident students who don't attend our schools. And you'll see how that explains a huge part of the deficit. So when we look at this projection, and it's going 5 years out, so this is going to inform our projection for next year, but it also will show you how the death spiral, so how it compounds over time for the next 5 years. So just a few quick pieces here on the assumptions. It's assuming flat funding for all of our state funding and city funding. It assumes the magnet operating grant is going to continue to decrease. That is the trend we have seen as fewer suburban students have enrolled. I will also say the state put less funding into the magnet operating grant for this year than last year. Federal grants, we actually have seen an increase over time, likely due to student need, but this we will obviously need to monitor really closely given the federal environment right now. And so it's about $30 million of federal funding that we get. I know we've talked a little bit about it, and so we're just going to need to monitor that over the course of this budget season. It also assumes a decrease in some state grants, which we've seen over time, and then an increase in terms of our private fundraising and billing as we've been increasing things like Medicaid billing and tuition billing over time. So those are the assumptions that are going into the revenue side of the equation. Main takeaway is it's largely flat, if not decreasing funding. And so you'll see that on this chart. Essentially, the forecast is what's starting in FY27, and you see it's a slight decline over time. You can see the biggest parts are flat. That's our ECS funding from the state, from the city, and then our magnet operating grant and other state grants are decreasing over time. So this is kind of our baseline level, not assuming the city's going to give us any more money, not assuming anything happens at the state level, basically remaining flat and slightly decreasing over time. So that's the flat funding story on revenue. On the expense side of things, these are the biggest categories of the budget. So the first piece is salaries and benefits. What I've updated this to reflect is what we know right now. And so we know there's likely going to be some decreased total positions next year because of enrollment decline, but increased fill rates. So we're probably going to fill more of those positions closer to that 3% vacancy rate, which is what the trend was prior to the pandemic. And we know there's going to be increases to salaries as part of the contracts. When it comes to the fixed expenses, so tuition, transportation, utilities, this is looking at historical data to look at the rate of increase we've seen over time. So you can see tuition has been increasing at a rate of about 6%, transportation at 4%, utilities at 8%. And then everything else, which is the smallest part of the budget, so those are other non-salary items that we have more control over, is just assuming essentially a low level of inflation. When we look at that on the chart, same thing here, you have the historical data and then you have the forecast, and you can see the increases every year. And so the biggest category of increase there is tuition is just continuing to grow over time. It's 30% of our budget right now, and that's increasing at a rate of 6%. And you can also see some smaller increases in the other areas. So main takeaway, flat funding with actually some decreased revenue, and then increased expenses over time. when you put all this together, and this is just the total budget, so total revenue, total expense, and then I'll get to just the non-HPS students next, then you can see the forecast. What you see here for 2026, I've already factored in what we just talked about. So that was the 4.6-ish million in revenue that we thought we were going to have that we won't because of enrollment decline, and the 11 million less in vacancy savings than we thought. So those two numbers added together are about that 15.6. So I'm updating that for this current year, 2026, so that we can make better predictions for the future. And what you see there is 27 out until 31. Essentially, the deficit is growing every year because that revenue number is going slightly down and that expense number is continuing to go up. This is a version of what I shared with Marb. I didn't have the latest data at that time, but the story was the same. I think the gap in 2031 was closer to 80 million, but the story is the same, that this is, as described, a death spiral of if revenue is not changing or it's going down and expenses are going up, especially in things like tuition and transportation, it becomes really unsustainable. I will say, I'll caveat this, we are going to come back next month with a more precise estimate for next year as we keep getting more data, as we put it into our budget software. But this is, as of right now, I wanted to show the trend, at least over time, of the magnitude of what we were talking about. Now, this slide, and then there'll just be one more and we can pause. This slide is showing Hartford resident students who attend non-HPS schools. And I think this is what we have been talking about this whole time. And it's displayed in a way where you see the revenue that we get for those students. So the revenue we get for students who are Hartford residents who don't attend our schools, there's our ECS, education cost sharing funding. So this is both what the state and city contribute, and we get per pupil amounts for those students. I've also included excess cost. That is the money we get for special education when a student costs 4.5 times the average per pupil. All of those students don't attend our schools. So kids who attend Hartford Public Schools are not costing, that means more than $90,000 a year. So those are all students who are attending schools that are not HBS. So those are the two forms of revenue. And then when you look at expenses, that's where we pay tuition, and then we pay transportation for door-to-door special education transportation. So the state covers transportation for gen ed if they don't need door-to-door when they're going to Crack or other schools, but we pay if it's door-to-door. And as you can see, half of our transportation budget is actually door-to-door transportation for students who are going to non-HPS schools. And so when I was doing this, what I was struck by was that it essentially explains the full magnitude of the deficit. And so when you look at our budget for this year, we had a difference for students not attending HPS schools of about 30 million, which is exactly what we had to mitigate from the budget. And when you look at next year, it's closer to 35 million, which is very close to what that total gap is. And so what you can see is that the deficit that we are experiencing every single year that is driving our need to constantly have to make reductions is largely because of the choice system in which the money we are getting for students who leave does not match the expenses that we pay. And so I shared this at the MARB meeting, and we discussed it. And I think I am hopeful that the other folks from the state there, and the mayor was there as well, started to understand that this truly is the challenge that we're experiencing. And actually the governor's team reached out to me already to ask some follow-up questions, get more information. And I said, honestly, in this scenario, I would rather not have any of this revenue if we did not have to pay these expenses, because that's where the deficit is coming from. We would have had 30 million more dollars this year, if not for this. And so I think that there is opportunity to discuss what would it look like if that revenue actually for each student just went to the school that they were attending, and then they were making decisions about how to service that student. Because right now, essentially, those students are going elsewhere, and then we are paying for various services without being the ones to educate them. And that's my read. And now my, 9 months, 10 months in this role, that is the crux of what is happening, is that the choice system where we are not making decisions about or educating students, but we are paying for it, is what is causing the dynamic that we've been in. So I definitely wanted to bring this all to you all. I think it puts numbers to a lot of what we've been talking about. And I think we need to continue to advocate. And I think there may be some momentum at the state level in terms of having a really frank conversation about what this has meant for our budget. And so I'll do a quick, just few next steps, and then we can open it up. So like I mentioned, a next step that we're going to be taking is just fleshing out that projection for next year. We have that new budget software. We're really excited about it. We'll be able to load everything into there, do various scenarios, see what they cost, and then have that be the one place everyone is building their budget. And then, as we've discussed, we want to do more community engagement. We have a tool actually that lets us to ask just a quick question to the community and get all of their feedback and automatically synthesize it. And so I'd love to start doing that now and in this month, just to start to both get their input on what's most important to them, and it's a way that we can continue to do the education piece. And then we're starting to look at, okay, for the things in our locus of control, only to a certain degree, but parts of these we have locus of control over. Let's start planning for next year on, things aligned to our strategic plan, potential reductions. And so we've started to have conversations on some of those biggest areas like special education, the staffing plan. I will say briefly on this school closure consolidation piece, the plan is to do an RFP. So we're working with the city to put out a request for proposals to have an objective firm do an analysis there. And I will say I shared with the state as well. Consolidating schools cannot be the only thing to solve this problem. You would save about $1 million for consolidating 2 schools into one, and it really should be more focused on what is going to be best for the student experience. So we talked about that a bit at Marv as well. And then finally, what I just said, structural change, continuing to use all of the knowledge and information we have to advocate to change how we are funded so that we can get out of this dynamic. So I will pause there and open it up.
Thank you, but are all other board members you can't be excited about a deficit number, but definitely when we're in the community, we always knew and we were always calling it out, but we were never able to call it out with a number. That's essentially our deficit each year. So thank you for putting a number there for us. So when we speak and engage the community, we have that. And it seems odd because an assumption is made that when a child is diagnosed or identified with special needs, that there is all these extra weights that come with it, and those, pay for the child's education and everything that comes along with this. But this shows that it does not. So thank you for that. I see Mr. Tatum.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I want to echo a lot of gratitude for this slide in particular. And thank you for presenting it so clearly to the MARB and the other stakeholders that were there. I know, or I've gotten the sense from speaking at the Capitol and just talking about sort of Hartford education around more broadly, that this dynamic of the funding coming in for educating our students that choose to go to other school systems doesn't match what we're billed, and so this lays it out in a way that I hope will raise the understanding of this part of the dynamic that's really not working in how we're funding the choice system. Just a couple clarifying questions, if I could. The tuition expense that's in this chart, is that is based on does that include general and special education tuition?
It includes both, yes.
And for the general education, that is assuming a continuation of the 58% of whatever year that was.
Yes,
cap
this
that's
would
been
be
placed.
higher without that, yes.
Right. So yeah, it's just interesting to think about, like when I think about like what levers might be pulled short of a like big overhaul um, of how the funding system works. Like that mechanism of a percentage-based tuition cap is like in my mind there. But anyway,
No, it's a good point.
okay,
And
so
that's just for anyone listening, that essentially last year it started that they capped general education tuition at 58%, and that continued into this year. And so, yes, I agree with you. That's one mechanism to think about, is capping tuition at a certain percent.
and the legislature, I think, would tend to want to use a tool that they've already used in a way, like they already kind of know how it works, and it's like just politically kind of easier to work with. But even then, like I think that this shows that even if you capped it at 50% or 35%, like some of these dynamics could be still similar. I don't know, I would need to do a lot of math. But that clarifies just what is going into that tuition number for me. So thank you for that. Interested to see what this new community tool will be. Like that sounds like a neat opportunity. Could you and thank you also for lifting the sort of different factors that play into the strategic decisions about school consolidation, and pointing out that if you're talking about consolidating two schools into one, you're talking about saving maybe $1 million. And so the conversation about consolidation, what I hear you saying is it should be based on what's best for students and less so out of a perceived need to get out of a financial budgetary challenge. I think that point is really important as we continue to talk about these issues, that although we face financial pressure and there's some sense that it would be fiscally responsible to consolidate schools, I think the actual budget reality of that is that it doesn't save a huge amount of money on its own compared to some of these other factors. And that like we should really be focusing on those educational factors and seeing if there is need there. And so I'm glad to hear that there's an RFP eventually in the future for some further study of that. I think it's something that would benefit all of us board members as we think about the issue, and the community as well, since it's an idea that we hear community members talking about and staff members talking about. So I'm looking forward to, over the next several months, like getting some better real information from which we can start talking about the issue more substantively than just sort of feelings that we have about the budget or about vacancies or educational opportunity or things like that. So I'll leave it there and let others jump in. But overall, thank you very much. Super clear and really important information.
Thank you. And just to clarify, the RFP is not for someone to come in and just look to see, do an analysis and say, oh, how much will you save by consolidating? It's much more bigger and more comprehensive than that, than as to what they'll be looking into. So
Yes, sorry, my screen was, yes. So it's going to be much more about the student experience. And so, yes, there's a component of, and what would this save, but much more things like, let's look at some of what you shared, the data over time throughout the year of student patterns in terms of enrollment, what that means for our feeder patterns, and what it means for student experience, because are students able to have access to all different course offerings, unified arts, et cetera? What does that mean for staffing? So it's definitely going to look more holistically at student and teacher experience, with the piece that, and what would we save, but without, that won't be the focus point.
thank you. So Mr. Walker.
Yeah, thank you. Caitlin, terrific slides. I wish you could go back to the summary slide. One request is you've brought up the hard data on consolidation savings. I feel like as a board, we need like a 4 or 5 slide talk book that allows us to translate things we've been saying intuitively, but just to be able to say it in a concrete fashion. the other factor, your summary slide, maybe you can't get it back.
My screen has gone crazy, and then I started drawing on it somehow. So I'm trying. I don't know if Christine,
No.
if you could pull up the last slide of the deck.
It's okay because at the beginning of the evening, my computer was also pulling up a lot of data. I couldn't control it for a while either. So
Oh, I
since
think it's
that
coming.
okay,
There we
well,
go.
that's fine.
Thank you, Christina.
The other thing is some key takeaways. I think the thing that you presented tonight that I did not know is the uncontrolled rate of growth of tuition. That has to be shown to all stakeholders, states, local. There's no way for us to budget our way out of that. There's no cutting you can do. That has to be elevated. Because it's not sustainable. I don't know how that can be. That can't be our future. It just can't. So that rate of increase, I think we should have that kind of elevated. I don't know who owns it, but we should be giving that to someone to say we need to help get that where they're aligned. So beyond the talk book here, God, I had one thing I was actually about is the on the immediate level, because we have dramatically lower tuition. Last year as a board, we enacted a policy to allow classrooms to be increased to like 26 or 27 students. I think we need to grab this data of lower enrollment and to find a way to empower school-based leaders, principals, and staff to rejigger some of these classrooms. To me, given what you presented, there should be no reason that students need be in 26 or 27 person classrooms when we seemingly now have the capacity to allow students to be in classrooms of 23 and 24 students and have a better educational experience. I don't know. I don't have hard data with how many classrooms like that, but I know we enacted that policy. I know some classrooms are at that level. Is there a way that this data can be fed through the system to help now, leaders to be able to make some changes that will help students and actually help teachers with this educational experience? I mean, I think to me, the story of that we now have smaller classroom size could be a great silver lining to come out of the lower enrollment story, which obviously won't be totally positive to a community.
I'm glad you brought
So
that up because
I don't know if you
actually,
guys feelings about
yeah.
that.
No, the team, we've actually been looking at every single classroom essentially in data. And so in general, yes, classrooms are smaller than what we thought because there's fewer students and we have high staffing rates. And actually the schools team and academics team are looking right now, especially at secondary schedules, to see what moves could be made to make sure that we're optimizing for the student experience. And so that is some of the data that folks are looking at. Because I think you're right. That is the silver lining here is we did hire a lot more teachers, which is really exciting. And there is the opportunity for students to have that experience. And so so I guess the takeaway is classes are smaller than what we thought they were going to be. And the team are looking school by school right now alongside principals to try to look at some of that data. So we can bring an update on that too.
So through the chair, then quick follow-up, can you just report back out to us then? Because I think that is a really positive story once you've done that analysis, if you're already now going school by school, because
Yeah.
I just would like to be able to say that we've gotten this benefit out of our current situation.
Yes. Yep.
I don't know that she's saying that will, I think she's saying that they're analyzing all of the classrooms to know what the next steps will be as far as staffing.
Yes, because there's some, and I can clarify. So there's some, what I can share with you for sure is some data on what is currently true. Because what I will say is, what is true is there are some smaller class sizes. Then some of the next steps, we're trying to minimize any disruptions, but there are some moves that could be made that would still minimize disruptions of that just make sense in terms of teachers or where it makes sense to adjust class sizes. It's a process we call class size adjustment. And so then we can share with you where we land in that process. But yes, to Ms. Brody's point, it's kind of an ongoing piece to inform some of the decisions that are happening. But we can at least share where are we at in terms of class sizes for this year, and then what are some of those decisions shaping up around class size adjustments.
Yeah, and Chair, that's what I was saying. I wasn't advocating for staff or less, but it's staffing is good where we have it. We have good staff now and low vacancy rates. It's more of can we tell the story that we've optimized and every student possible can have a great classroom experience, because we've now got, I just still hear about some classes with 14 students and some classes still have 24 students. And I just feel like, can we find a way to kind of, if it's not crazy, to kind of optimize things so everyone has a better classroom experience? I think that's what you're saying you're doing. So we'll just wait to see how this all plays out. But that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, we definitely want more teachers, less students. That is definitely what we all desire. I don't think that's anyone, everyone here is a desire, but reality will meet that. So looking forward to seeing how that works out across schools, across grades. Some grades we know it's harder to make adjustments with staff, like the older, the high school, some very hard there. But I do see Ms. Daristow Ledger hand up, followed by Ms. Fortune.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. The question I have a question about the software that you're going to be using for public consumption. Like, how did you select this software? What did it cost? And if you can tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, and so this was, I believe it was the August board meeting that we brought it to you all. And so to summarize it, it's a budget software that connects directly to Munis, which is the financial system that we use. And it's actually part of PowerSchool. So that's the system we use for our student data. So it integrates really well into our system. And that was one of its main benefits, is it speaks to the data that we have. And what it allows us to do is, instead of using many different spreadsheets, it puts it all in one place so that we can do things like test different scenarios for how we could allocate teachers to school sites and see what that would mean for each school instantly and see how much that total cost would be. So we can test different options for how we essentially allocate dollars. And then it'll sum that up into what does that mean for the budget. And then what it allows is that when a school leader or a department lead is doing their budget, they're doing it directly in the software. So previously they were doing it in separate spreadsheets. We were trying to pull all that together and then use that to put together the full budget and make a budget book. And now it's all happening in one place. So we'll do all of our scenarios, we'll land on what we're allocating, they'll make decisions, and it actually goes through a chain of approval. So they'll need to get approval from the budget team, from their supervisor. We lock it all in, and then it'll allow us to produce the budget book directly from that. So I think the main takeaway is time saving and accuracy, and it'll just streamline a lot of the work. And it cost about I think it was about $120,000.
Great, thank you so much. And I have a follow-up question, not really a follow-up question, but with regards to the consolidation piece. Have you looked at, or are you looking at class size? And yes, we would, as an educator, smaller class sizes, sometimes, more desirable depending on what grade you're teaching. However, if you have, say, several classrooms that have lower enrollment as opposed to other classrooms, have you considered consolidating classrooms to perhaps, for example, if you have, say, fifth grade, you have 5 fifth grade classroom teachers or 5 fifth grade classrooms, and you have perhaps 12 in one classroom, 8 8 in another, 15 in another, are you looking at, okay, what are some ways perhaps we can, maybe, not saying you don't want to, lay anyone off or eliminate a teaching position, but not so much eliminating a teacher, but repurposing that individual, because I know that tends to happen based on certifications and shortage areas where you have the individual there who has that certification and can meet that need, but it's almost a win-win.
Yes, and that's actually, you described it better than I did. That is the process we're doing. We're looking at every class size and looking at what potential moves could be made to optimize, essentially.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Ms. Fortune?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my first question is about the Blue Ribbon Commission. Caitlin, are you in touch with them more from sort of the HPS perspective? Because I know they do get a lot of opportunities to share with governor's office and various other stakeholders their findings and what they think should be done. So how in sync are they with the findings that you've shared with us today, and at least the advocacy in terms of what we should be doing to hopefully eliminate that gap in funding by hopefully shifting funding to just have the student's funding go directly to the school instead of us getting the CCS and then having to pay the full rate of whatever the cost is?
Yeah, so I wasn't involved in the Blue Ribbon Commission, but in looking at the recommendations, there was the piece around the structural changes that need to happen. I would say it's in line, but a more precise version of that, because I think the recommendations are around, continue to advocate at the state legislature for funding changes. But I think this would take it one level more detailed to say, and the specific funding change we would recommend, for example, is a pass-through of that revenue or capping tuition. And so I think it's in line with what they've been saying, but I think it's just a more precise lever that we would be advocating for.
Okay, but you haven't had
I haven't been
specific
involved though.
conversations. Okay, but you haven't spoken to them at all either, just in terms of
No,
what they're sharing?
no.
Okay,
Yeah, I got the report when it came out, but that was it.
yeah. Okay.
But I'm open to talk. Anyone who wants to talk about this, I'm happy to be a part of that.
Right. I think I was curious, particularly because my understanding is they're having plenty of access to speak about the structural issues and what can be done. And to the extent we could merge those efforts and be on the same line, particularly if we have data to be more specific in terms of their general findings, we'd want to do that, particularly because, we could agree on the big picture that there needs to be change, but who knows if that's what they're thinking the change should be or what.
No, you're right. And the more aligned we can be on this story and what we're advocating for, definitely the better.
My understanding is that the Blue Ribbon Commission was supposed to do what they did, put out a report and be dissolved. Why they're continuing and whatever, that is actually unclear to me as far as their purpose now. Because if you read and understood the original timeline, their purpose and all of that, it was to do their analysis and to put out a report. But now it seems like the life of them is being extended for what I kind of don't really understand. It's kind of odd to me, but that was the original purpose of the commission.
So I'll share.
That's also, go ahead.
I have the report pulled up here. There were 3 things that they asked for, really 2 priority areas, 3 priority areas. The first one was a strategic vision and advocacy. So it says by July 25, create a shared vision implementation plan, including equitable funding and enrollment policies for all schools in the Hartford education system. And the second one is priority for academics by December 25, collaborate with relevant stakeholders, including Board of Ed, CBOs, parents, staff to create update policies and practices to ensure students have a safe and welcoming environment. And the last priority area was school connectedness. It says by December 25, create collaborative partnerships, structures, and processes that ensure all students and families have access to wraparound services. So it was kind of broad in general, as what it's kind of what we're already doing. So there were no very big specifics, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I think that's why we should, if they're not seeking us out, we should proactively seek them out, because I believe people are listening to at least some members of the committee. They're getting into rooms to share their findings to the extent that, and we do have more information that where we could be more specific. If they could include what we've just discussed as they're speaking to others, or if we can help them sort of narrow their recommendations, because we have all of this data to support what we think works, that could only advance our own agenda and purposes. But I understand that it's not always the case that, I know I've had limited interaction with the Blue Ribbon Commission personally, but I think so is the case for the rest of the board. I also know, I think in our meetings, the group meetings we do with the mayor, he mentioned that he was already willing to do some type of study related to consolidation. And I know the RFP we have out is for something much broader. But is there an opportunity to get some funds to do this, more comprehensive study that we're doing? Because it will also include how can consolidation help? Just an idea, because he said he was willing to engage in such a study, presumably has the funds to pay for that.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah, absolutely. I think it could go directly with that.
Anyone is stopping the mayor from doing any study that he wants to do. We never have been. I want our study to be what we want. And I don't want us to lose sight of that. We all know certain people stand on and what they think is best. We're saying we need to know all the things about our school district so we know what is best, and it's informed by the data that's collected. I know my conversations have definitely been along the lines of knowing what we have, and knowing how we can make informed decisions based on when we have that that information. So it's like I have a problem with agendas and us falling into that, as opposed to there's many different reasons why we need to know at this given time. Hence our meeting tonight, right? Our budget. How does forecasting out, like enrollment, the chef settlement, how many more seats are going to become available in the upcoming years, all of those things that affect how we run the school system. Those are the things we're looking for out of our study. And I don't know what the city is looking for out of their study.
I think the scope of, as I understand it, the limited discussion I've had on this, it's fairly limited in scope from the city, but because our scope is much broader, and it will cover potentially how do we make structural changes to improve educational experience and possibly consolidate schools, if that makes sense, maybe we can get some funds from the city. It shouldn't be to alter what our purpose is or to narrow the scope. We should maintain, this is the study we're conducting. Do you have any money to support that? Because it seems like it will inform how we make difficult and important decisions about the school district. And arguably, all reasonable people who care about education should be on board with that.
Yeah, I'm definitely wary of what we are as a school district and what the city is tasked to do. Sometimes it goes together and sometimes it doesn't. But that's not my, that's a decision, for the superintendent, and how, he's moving forward, with the study and what exactly, he's looking for out of it. Mr. Walker?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't want to prolong this discussion. I just wanted to ask Caitlin, do we have capacity with the amongst like the grant management group to help us pursue maybe little chunks of money to fund this kind of study? And occasionally you can get little grants to do things like this kind of study around consolidation or right sizing and things, because we just had so many changes in our environment, both federal funding and then, now with this, what you would call it, immigration shifts and changes, pretty significant numbers. I mean, numbers that look significant enough that it would feel like we could go to a funder and maybe convince them to slide us a little bit of money to do a little small study around how we could effectively address it, with consolidation being one of the topics on that line item. So,
We can look
And respectfully, Mr. Walker, we're making this into a consolidation study, and that is not what it is. I feel that's where this conversation is going, but that is not what we're doing.
I hear. I understand. I think that the question that I have here was just, can we get funding to do the study? And all I was really saying is that if we do a study, there's no need to take anything off the table. It's just, can we do a study and we can decide in a grant proposal all the things we want to have consideration, in this particular study that we would do, and whether somebody would help us fund it from a granting standpoint. That's really all I was seeking, Chair.
I don't know if we're going in that direction. I think they're pretty much ready to put out an RFP. Because the study is telling us what we need to do. You know what I'm saying? So if the study says you have too much of something, right? So the study, we're using that to help us make better decisions instead of calling for a study with a specific thing in mind, trying to make it true. So that's just my thought. Like we want to say, what do we have and what direction should we be moving in, as opposed to, we have too many schools, we need to close them and creating a study to justify it. That is not what we're doing.
To the chair,
I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm just
no. I totally embrace that. What I want Caitlin to try to address is, do we have capacity in that grant area for that kind of grant to be created? I was trying to really address a small issue of, if we want to do an independent study, where can we get a source of funding to do that independent study beyond anything that maybe the city is doing? That's what I was asking Caitlin about, a potential source of funding.
Yes, and I think we can look into grant opportunities for sure to fund the study that we're talking about, which is much more comprehensive.
Yeah, was there funds identified? I don't know that we did not have the funds for the study. I thought that wasn't a issue.
It'll end up being dependent, and we're working through that right now, and it'll end up being dependent on the scope and length of time. And so there's some funds set aside, but I think depending on how comprehensive we want it to be, it could get more expensive, especially depending on what folks submit back in terms of, the team size and timeline. So I think there is some money set aside. It is worth looking into any opportunity that would allow us to be as comprehensive as possible. So I think it's a both and.
Okay. Ms. Darristow Ledger, followed by the superintendent.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, if there are, if folks know, board members specifically, if they know of any funding that's out there, or, small buckets of money, perhaps they can be used to bring free lunches back, or they can be used to bring, purchase items like Chromebooks that some schools may be lacking, things like that. So I'm thinking about that. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Dr. Townsville?
Yes, I just want to share this information. So everywhere I go within our community, I do know that school consolidation and possible closures are a major topic of discussion. Even when I speak with, I met with a handful of city council members as well, and that conversation is in their lexicon real heavy. I think everyone agrees on the politician side that we need to close or consolidate schools, but there is no specific reason as to why, meaning because it's going to generate XYZ amount of dollars or something like that. But that is out there. In addition, the general public, from people that I've spoken with across the community, North, South End, are very apprehensive about the conversation of school closures. But I do think it's important because it's a conversation that is definitely out there. I think it's important for us to find a way to collaboratively with the mayor specifically, because he's the biggest advocate for it, to have an open conversation about that dialogue, whichever way we decide to go. I think we do need to find a way to communicate that conversation and just pick a direction of what we're going to do. Because as a superintendent, I don't want to skate around it on either side, because I kind of feel like I'm in the middle while trying to ensure that our system is the best it could possibly be. This big piece that's kind of hanging out there about consolidation and closure, I just want to tackle it and address it head on. But I'm more than happy to listen to members of the board to share best ways to really do that, just so I don't feel like I'm kicking the can down the road to a degree. I just want to attack it, address it, and we ultimately decide what we like to do as a board.
Question to you, are we waiting for a study or no? Like, if we're a little confused now.
No, we're not waiting on a study. What we need to do as a school system is to probably put a request for proposal to do the work and get us the factual information. However, when I mentioned that to Mayor Aralampalam, he's afraid of he doesn't want us to put a press release out. A RFP out without having a conversation first. So I'm really trying to understand what that means. I'm more than happy to have a open forum about it with the mayor, just to have a united front tackling the concern, and then going from there with the request for proposal. Caitlin did a great job drafting some language of what we'd like to learn from it. But I think if it's myself and the mayor, probably with a forum, how I've done, the different talks in the community, probably with that being the specific topic, and just addressing it head on. And then that will provide us next steps. So if a request for a proposal did go out, it wouldn't catch anybody off guard, because there's a clear conversation that's occurring.
Okay, because I know the mayor is desperate to have a conversation about, and I hate consolidation. We're going to call it school closure because that's what it is. So I know he's desperate to have a public conversation about school closure. Just know that if we're having this conversation, I don't know, there is no board member besides myself that went through the last school closure that we had, and it is not light. So right. You're going to be responsible to this community when we're having conversations and we have no data to support the conversation. Like, because there's going to be many, many questions. It is like probably the worst, not some of the worst, it is the worst meetings I had as a board member when that was being done and being talked about. There is a lot of emotion there's a lot of fear, and it's not just a community thing. When I say not, residents, we have staff that we're responsible to. We're now attracting, as Ms. Richard just said, we're attracting more staff. But trust me, when we start that conversation, it is a for real thing, and it is not light. It is the worst time of being a board member, in my opinion. So if we're just having a conversation we have to have something to give. And that was my conversation with the mayor. We're just talking, but what are we telling them? What are we offering them other than fear? So that is all. That's where I land at in regards to talking about school closures.
So I like that. So what my thinking is, because it's being pushed by the mayor, my thinking is allowing him to lead it and me there as a support, and not us as a board really pushing the conversation, but as the new superintendent supporting by listening as much as I can. And once we get all of that feedback, then I can execute with how we go about doing the study. But the conversation is not going away. And I'm more than happy to allow him to lead the conversation. As a new member of the community, I'm learning to suck up all the data, anecdotally, quantitative and qualitative, to execute a plan with our CFO with the request for proposal to get our factual data, because we did share that, what's the basis, what's the data, and there is none. But allowing them to lead it, I think that's totally fine with me. I think I can navigate that pretty well, just for the result of just getting the information that I need to take our next step. Because I don't want us as a board to be accused of not addressing it. I'm more than happy to address it and ride the wave of it while collecting information to execute it best for us.
Okay, I just hope we're not saying like this is our meeting. The
No.
city is leading this, and their meeting, because I just hate that we don't have anything to offer at all, because we haven't done our due diligence.
And that's exactly what I would say, is that we as a district do not have the facts, but this is a conversation. I'm supporting the mayor with listening at his forums so I can gather all the input, and then we do what we need to do with the information to make it palatable for our community that we're serving.
Thank you.
No problem.
Ms. Fortune?
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to what I suggested earlier. Essentially, I think, given that there is no data, given that the mayor wants to do a study that is very narrow in scope about consolidation, we want to do a study that is much broader in scope. We don't yet have all the funding. I think this is a way to invite some more behind the scenes conversation by accepting funds, if he's so willing, to help fund our study, because it will include some of the things he's interested in. I think that is something to consider. It's an invitation to have more talks, and maybe that reduces the desire for a public forum. Maybe it doesn't. But I think it's the missed opportunity. Even if it goes nowhere, I think it's a missed opportunity to not just invite and ask for funding to support a study that will allow us to better educate our students, whether it ends up being we consolidate or we don't consolidate. But we're going to do all of the studies for improving educational experience for students, which ultimately, what I understand from the mayor directly, his view for wanting to consolidate, he said it has nothing to do with cost savings. It's all to create academic centers of excellence into the remaining schools. So our study ultimately boils down to, how do we improve educational experience? I would think he a reasonable person would be interested and could support the funding that study.
Thank you, Ms. Darristow Ledger.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that if I'm understanding correctly, there have been funds set aside for this RFP for this study, correct?
Yes, I'll find the amount and get back to you. But the point is that additional funding could help make it more comprehensive, I think is the
Okay. Okay. And the other question, well, I wanted to, kind of echo what the superintendent suggested. I think that having a forum, if you will, just a listening, an opportunity to hear what the community is saying, an opportunity to hear what the mayor is looking for, an opportunity to hear us, but mostly from the community and what the mayor has to say to justify wanting to consolidate because and hearing the concerns from the community because oftentimes it helps to have the constituents, parents, students in front of you when you're making a specific request. The other thing I want, and then that way we can gather, the superintendent can gather the data, the mayor can, give his data if he has any, but we still have this, have this RFP go out, have this study done to find out what is best, what is the best solution. And once again, I'm going to just put it out there again. If there are funds that anyone has available, let's perhaps bring the school lunches back. And also because there are other districts who have done that. But also there are perhaps materials such as Chromebooks that are needed so that the students can get their work done and be successful and achieve what they need to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mills.
Yes, I actually sort of want to piggyback off of what Francois said. I didn't realize that Hartford students didn't have free lunch entirely. Like I recognize that we typically, most of them sort of apply for free or reduced lunches by virtue of the poverty limit in Hartford. But I just sort of wanted to point out that like on a deeply personal level, I think that the state should be providing free lunch for everybody. So I just sort of hoping that we could add that to our legislative agenda. I also think that whether by look of CFO Richard's face, it looks like we might already do that. But in terms
Yeah,
of
we have community eligibility for sure,
Yeah.
which is free lunches. And so I don't want to speak out of turn, but I was also operating from that assumption that we're community eligible.
Excellent. Either way, I still think that that should be a thing that we should add to our legislative policy agenda. By virtue of the state does not like the city. We are all aware of that. But I think that if we care about the rest of the state, even tangentially, it helps our case going forward. So this is not really a conversation for now, but if we could just add like Hartford is, pro free lunch for everybody in the state, then I think that might help whatever sort of alliances we need to form with the rest of the state as we ask for more money for other things. That's all.
Thank you.
Sorry, may I jump in, Madam Chair? We're still giving free lunches to all students in Hartford, right? That's my understanding. My 3 children are all in Hartford schools. They're getting free lunches. And
That
I
is my
don't,
understanding too.
okay, so I'm not sure what the free lunch conversation is about with respect to Hartford. Because I think, I would know if my kids weren't getting lunches at school, although, maybe it's other districts, but as far as I know, in HPS, kids are getting free lunches.
I don't know that any lunch. I have a child in the school system, and I don't pay for anything. I know that, of course, we've all heard the students and their advocacy around what's offered for lunch. And I know that because we are a district that gets free lunch, that comes with guidelines on like the nutrition of the school lunch and the whole grain and all of those things that come along with it, that I don't know that students are particularly liking because the ingredients have to be in a certain manner for us to be eligible to participate and receive that free lunch. But that is that is what I know. In regards to our students having to pay for lunch, I am not aware. Yeah, I'm not aware of that. And I don't know if Ms. Darrell Ledger knows of a Hartford public school that is. I know some other districts may, but I'm not sure that it's here. Nothing will surprise me as far as with this administration, but as of now, I don't know that anything has changed in our lunch program.
If I may, once Caitlin sort of interjected on that, I still want to point out that like my main concern is that like as a policy for the city of Hartford, it might do us well if we advocate on behalf of other municipalities in the state as well, as we sort of need the state in other things. So I just think that as a long-term sort of goodwill policy, that if we advocate for other municipalities to also get free lunches, that might help us in the long run. So that's all.
Yeah, well, who has the appetite? And I don't want to hold anyone longer. I know we're over time. Thank you, Ms. Richard, for your presentation. And if everybody is all set,